yin yang here. You've almost got a situation where you've got a left-hand side of the brain and a right-hand side of the brain. Okay, you've got these totally different ways that the brain is working. So one of them was probably more of like a mathematician and an engineer, and the other one was probably more like a painter or a composer. And I thought that was really interesting, because after the Buddha's death, obviously you've got numerous monks wondering, what do we do now? What happens now to this movement? Because it could have very easily just kind of drifted away and turned into nothing, which we kind of assume if you have a lot of these itinerant teachers living in this part of the world, teaching out in the open, out in the woods, not with permanent structures, things like that, that with their death, their followers probably drifted off and did other things. Okay, but that didn't happen here. And that's something that's really interesting, because we kind of have to figure out why that happened. And one of the things that is in the folklore, and we'll get to why it's kind of folkloric in a second, is they held the first council about 3 months after the Buddha died. So they gathered everyone together to try and figure out, how do we go forward with this? And the Sangha held true to its word. They selected Mahakassapa as the new patriarch. So after the Buddha's passing, that's our first patriarch, is Mahakassapa. And during this first council and leading up to the first council, apparently Mahakassapa was really rough on Ananda. And he kept referring to him as a boy, and kept introducing him as public as someone who has just entered the stream. This is kind of insulting for the guy that was the Buddha's personal assistant. So we kind of have to wonder what was really going on there. And apparently this sent Ananda into a really bad mental state. And he's like, I can't in good conscience attend this first conference without experiencing enlightenment. Maybe Mahakassapa's got a point. Maybe I'm not ready for this. And so the night before the conference was supposed to start, the first council, as he laid down, as he had more or less given up, his head hit the pillow and he achieved enlightenment. So the next day he was able to walk into this council enlightened. So we've got two enlightened guys leading this council. And the funny thing is they're still not getting along particularly well. They're not seeing eye to eye on a lot of these issues. So one of the things that I thought was a fairly funny exchange, Ananda says to the council, he said, well, before the Buddha passed, he told me that if the Sangha wishes, we can just abolish a lot of the minor rules. So we can get rid of this nitpicky stuff about what it is to be Buddhist and get on with the main idea. So Mahakassapa asked him, okay, well, did he tell you which rules, or did you ask which rules we can abolish? Ananda's answer was, no, I didn't. So we don't know. We're at a loss for what those were. Ananda, his great photographic memory failed him, or he just didn't even think to ask. So an interesting thing about the first council is, like I mentioned, the Sangha chose the first patriarch. The Buddha himself did not leave a successor. The Sangha chose the first patriarch. The council lasted 7 months. So for 7 months, these guys were debating what Buddhism was going to look like without the Buddha present. It took them 7 months to figure this out. And apparently they did, and things marched on for another 100 years. And the second council was held 100 years. Now we can assume 100 years later, there was probably nobody left alive that had been a direct student of the Buddha. And I'm kind of estimating that it was the fourth patriarch, Upagupta, that was probably the last guy that would have been a direct teacher, a direct student. if we're assuming roughly 20 to 30 years per patriarch, I think Upagupta IV, he was the teacher of the king Ashaka. And one interesting thing that he did was there was a festival, and the Hindu devil Mara showed up at this festival, and Upagupta was sent to deal with Mara, sent to deal with the devil that was prancing around at this festival. And when he got there, what he did, the first thing he did, he asked Mara to take the physical form of the Buddha, so that everyone at all the festival goers could actually see what the Buddha physically looked like. And Mara complied, because he's overcome by, the teaching and forthrightness of this patriarch. And everybody at the festival got a look at what the Buddha's physical presence. And that just kind of implies that Upagupta might have actually seen the Buddha. So I'm kind of envisioning him, a very, very young monk, way at the back of the room, seeing the Buddha off in the distance and not getting directly that close, but eventually becoming the fourth patriarch. I mean, that may just be fanciful thinking on my part, but that's just kind of assumption I made. But by the time we get to the second council 100 years later, we can assume that all of his original followers were gone, and that Buddhism had in some ways become something different. Luckily, due to Ananda's prodigious skills in memorizing, he was able to memorize all of the Buddhist discourses, and there was 82,000 of them. I mean, that's an incredible feat of memorization. And what he did was turn them into chants, so that monks could repeat them, the repetition over and over and over again. They'd remember these chants and pass them down, because it was another 400 years before anybody wrote any of this down. So by the time we get to the second council, there was a Chinese historian, elliston, and he states by the time of the second council, there were 18 different schools of Buddhism. And you can rest assured that these probably didn't agree on a lot of very, very basic things. But one of the things that's interesting is that elliston said all of that disagreement in the different 18 schools leading up to the second council was where you had the roots of Mahayana versus Theravada. So it was during this period that we had this divergent between these two primary trunks of the tree of Buddhism. And he said that Theravada is flourishing in the south, in Sri Lanka and Burma, Vietnam, even though it wasn't called Vietnam at the time, but these southern kingdoms. And he said the people that are still speaking Pali in the north of India, that was the roots of Mahayana Buddhism. Another interesting thing is that one of the things that the historians all agree on is that there probably actually was a second council. That by this point you had so many you had Buddhism breaking apart into different factions. elliston estimating that there was 18 major factions, that the second council had to happen because they had to agree on, okay, there has to be a basic tenet here. There has to be a basic tenet on what it is to be a Buddhist. And that was what the purpose of the second council was. There was no mention anywhere in any document of the first council until after the council occurred. So a lot of historians don't think that the first council even happened at all. So we're kind of left to wonder exactly what did happen. How did we go from the Buddha to Mahakassapa as the first patriarch? But in the second council, they came up with 10 points, and here's what it means. Here's the 10 points we've settled on. And some of them we're familiar with because they show up in our vows, but some of them were like really odd things. Like if you're going to store salt, you have to store it in a horn. Okay. You're not going to eat semi-churned butter after midday. Okay. I didn't write down all 10, but those were the two that stuck out at me. It was like, good gosh, we've got what is going to eventually be a worldwide movement, one of the most major spiritual movements in human history. And you guys are arguing about where we're going to store salt and when we're going to eat butter. But I guess at the time, those were burning issues. So, admittedly, the history is a little bit murky and somewhat conflicted here. But we can kind of imagine what sort of state all of these followers were left in after they had lost their teacher. And the teacher that they did lose. I mean, this was a major event. It was a cataclysm. This guy had taught for close to 50 years. We're probably looking at a few thousand followers. Some of his family members, a lot of these guys, extremely devoted. If you look at how devoted Ananda was, and then he's gone. They must have been in shock. The level of grief must have been really hard to calculate. But Mahakassapa, in his wisdom, said, we knew this was coming. There was no other end game here. We pick up and we move on. And the Buddha himself said, you've got the Dharma. I mean, it seems to me he's almost saying, you've got the Dharma. You don't need me. And it was the Buddha himself kind of, we've talked many times about that metaphor, is don't confuse the finger pointing at the moon for the moon. You've almost got the Buddha himself saying, I'm just another finger pointing at the moon. I'm going to die, and, you're going to cremate my body, and you guys are going to have to move on without me. But I left you a roadmap of how to do it. So I think that's kind of the important thing here is that we've got the Dharma, and we know it's a true path. When the Buddha told Subhata, the last person that he ordained, he said the true path is going to be the path it's got the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So the Buddha may have had a good point when he said, what do you need me for after I'm gone? You've got what you need. So we may be able to look at succession as a process, as that same process where the teacher basically says, you don't really need me. You've got what you need. And his successor is the next person that tells us that, and on and on and on until the end of time. Okay. So I'll throw it out to the floor. What do you guys think?
And folks, as always,
Ojo,
come off mute and speak. Thanks.
Yeah, let me just add a few points to that. Thank you, Shinjin, for that marvelous review. The historicity and how we perceive time, things like that. The historicity, I think, in Zen is not very important for the very reason that Shinjin's pointing out, that each master after Mahakassapa, then Ananda, and so on down the line, are kind of like the saints in Catholicism, where they each claim personal experience. So it isn't dependent upon anything outside of yourself. And in fact, if a Zen ancestor does not have personal experience, they're a fraud. So, and that's unlike other traditions, and other religious traditions are not like that. Only Jesus Christ had the imprimatur and so forth. And then the perception of time, those of you who know me know I'm just closing out my 80th year here. And I was thinking about that, looking at all the politics and Lincoln and all the stuff that's going on these days. And they keep saying we're the world's oldest democracy, 240 years old. Well, that's 3 of my lifetimes. So if you think, that's only 3 of my lifetimes. So if you think whoever was 80 years old the year I was born had been born in 1860, before the Civil War, or at the beginning of the Civil War. Whoever was 80 years old in 1860 had been born in 1780, right in the middle of the Revolution. I mean, when you think about it like that, it's kind of gobsmack, mind blower, that's not a lot of time. 250 years is not a lot of time. And then I don't think a lot of the historicity is important for other reasons. but I think it's interesting that we go back and study it, especially in the light of succession. What is it that is actually transmitted? And of course, we claim, in Soto Zen, we claim to transmit mainly the method Zazen. That's what we can teach. It's like teaching music. You can't teach music. You can only teach somebody how to play an instrument and so forth. So good. That was about it. Could be something else.
Oh, Kaisa.
Shinjin Sensei, you said something about Mahakasyapa having a big ego, and you also said that he was enlightened during the Buddha's lifetime, and I was wondering if you could speak to what having a big ego after enlightenment means.
That's a great question. From the sources that I used, they're both here in the library, World of the Buddha, and there's one called Life of the Buddha by a guy named Nanamoli. They both kind of described him as liking, kind of liking to be the guy in charge, liking to be the final word. And, there's numerous accounts of how rough he was on Ananda. I mean, just insulting him in public and telling him he didn't know what he was talking about, telling him he wasn't ready. And apparently they were about the same age. And what's kind of funny is they give the deaths for both Ananda and Mahakassapa they just both said around 20 years after the Buddha's death. So these guys were kind of like, they seem to me kind of inextricably bound together in this really weird way. And I think that there's maybe I'm inferring, or maybe there is an implication that it took both of them for Buddhism to survive the Buddha's death. It took, the rational, hyper rational, mathematical engineering brain, but it also took the guy that could focus on people and emotional lives, and it was compassionate. The job was so big that one person probably couldn't have done it. It took both these guys coming at it from different angles. But one of the things that it keeps also kind of implying was that even though both of these guys had reached enlightenment, they had their flaws, they had their weaknesses. And I think, I can't claim to really understand enlightenment on such a level, but the thing is that, they say, a mountain's a mountain before you're enlightened. And then after you're enlightened, a mountain goes back to being a mountain. Well, I think that the same thing is probably going to be true of the self. I mean, you could have an enlightening realization and then go right back to still having some of the same flaws you've always had. The mountain goes back to being a mountain. The person goes back to being a jackass in some ways. I think that's a possibility. Yeah, it's not the once and forever experience that fixes absolutely everything, So I think it's kind of possible. He probably liked, being in charge and bossing people around and insulting Ananda in public. I don't know. That's just how it strikes me. The flaw. It's kind of like, if the difference between heroes in the New Testament between heroes in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, one of the importances is the flaws. Judaism's most important hero, or both of Judaism's most important heroes, Moses and King David, were both very flawed guys. David was probably suffering from narcissistic personality disorder. And Moses wouldn't do anything he was told. So I think we can kind of look at these guys in the same light. I mean, these are two of Buddhism's great heroes. Buddhism would not have survived if these two guys had not been there. But at the same time, both had some major flaws, and it's possible that enlightenment didn't fix them. Does that help?
I'm good. Yes.
Thanks a lot for the talk. I really enjoyed that. one of the things that struck me as being significant and important is the idea of tolerance for people that have different personalities from yourself. Had there not been that toleration between those two guys, they could have split up completely. And I think to apply that to our current situation is most important. I quite often feel at odds with some of my fellow members in the Silent Thunder Order, and I hope they will recognize that, and I will try my own best to recognize that, to try to be more tolerant for other people. But so thank you very much for that insight.
Thank you for that insight. That's you know, I think it just goes back to, you know, none of us know as much as all of us know, you know, and that's going to be the same thing running a Sangha, running an order, you know. Yeah.
Shinjin Sensei, this is Fusat speaking. I know everybody can't see me, but that's okay. One of the things for me, I think a lot of people keep coming back to it, is the complementary process of the two leaders. And even with what Ungan just said, I mean, it takes a little bit of both to be to find the middle way, it seems to me. So to kind of maintain and hold it and sustain it.
Yeah.
And can you speak a little bit about that give and take that you were, as you were reading, that you noticed throughout when you were doing your research? Because it seemed like there was a lot of tugging and pulling and pushing and
tugging and pulling and pushing. And I think that one of the things that could be happening, they could speak, this takes us almost back to John's question, in terms of, and even to Bill's insight. It's like, I can kind of see these two guys having these debates in front of a hall of, or an open field of over 500 monks, or however many there were. They say there were 500 at the first council, but like in the back of their head thinking, man, this guy drives me completely out of my mind, but he's got a good point. Mm-hmm. You know, I kind of get it. So I think that in both these men, you had enough of enough intellectual development and enough emotional maturity that they didn't get bound up in how they felt about the other guy. They knew they needed to work together, and they saw the other guy's point. I mean, one of the things that they apparently came out of the first council agreeing on was the role of women. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a huge concept. You know, what role are women going to have in this movement going forward? And if they could agree on that, I don't think that they would have worried about whether or not you were storing salt in a horn. Mm-hmm. So I think that is kind of an enlightenment in and of itself, is being able to look at another person, regardless of how they're rubbing you wrong, and see that, yeah, they've got a good point. They know something I don't.
And the other thing you mentioned too, Shinjin Sensei, was the fact that, yeah, we do have the Dharma, and the Dharma is kind of like the breadcrumbs, but until and actually have a relationship with the Dharma, do you have a true realization for the things for yourself? Can you speak a little bit about that and studying the Dharma? And I know a lot of us get bogged down in wanting to know everything about the Dharma, but then you have to have that balance with practice and actually the actual understanding of the Dharma for yourself.
Yeah, well, I think that what you need in terms of instruction, it changes as your experience changes. You know, I think when we first walk in here, you know, we need somebody, you know, we need to be looking at somebody that's wearing a robe that we can say, that guy knows a lot more than I do. And as we stay here longer and practice longer, our experience broadens and deepens, our understanding broadens and deepens, and our relationship with that person wearing the robe really changes. And I think you get to the point where you're figuring these things out for yourself, mainly because you're sitting and staring at a wall for so long that these realizations are coming to you. You know, you've heard the sutras over and over and over again, then all of a sudden you get this flash of insight just because you're sitting there. It's like, now I know what that means. Now I get that. And, you know, you start developing a deeper and deeper understanding. And I think that, you know, as we look through the sutras, there's things in there that are so opaque and the stone woman gets up dancing. You know, I see the reflection of a heron in a bowl of snow. That maybe at some point you'll have an insight and you'll figure that out too. But your relationship with the Dharma deepens as your experience deepens, and you become less reliant on the teacher in certain ways. You know, and I think in other ways we'll always be reliant on the teacher. You know, one of the things I think it's, you know, in our own case here, listen to how Hojo still talks about Matsuoka. You know, Matsuoka's left us almost 30 years ago, but there's still a palpable relationship there.
Gotcha. Thank you for your
help.
attention.
Yeah. Okay.
Keiko or Keisei? Okay. And again, folks, either on Facebook or if you're online, just shoot us a question or just come off a mute and just talk. The comments and observations are welcome. It's good to see some our Sangha from Falmouth. Welcome, Amy. Welcome, folks that we haven't seen before. Welcome, welcome.
I have a question for Sensei, because a lot of this, and as I was sitting, this was happening too, is relating to the razor's edge or the razor blade then. I may be misinterpreting your meaning of that idea, but this notion of neither this nor that, neither Mahakashyap's approach nor Ananda's, but the line between the two, as an example of one of many razor blade edges that cut through our experience. And sitting as a practice of balancing between these, I don't know if they're paradoxes necessarily, sometimes they are. Am I understanding that correctly, or was there something different that you mean by that? But that's what has been coming to mind. Yeah. Sensei, Hojo Sensei.
Oh, I didn't know that was for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, Matsuoka Roshi would use that term often. He'd say, just be like the razor's edge, just cutting through everything that comes to you. And it's become pretty clear to me that the way the mind naturally works is through a process of vacillation between extremes, from one extreme to the other. So you could reconceive the middle way as being both, as Buddha taught it in everyday life, the Eightfold Path, and balancing between desires, aversions, attachments, et cetera, but even when you're sitting in Zazen and very little else is going on and your mind has become very still, it still seems to work through a process of vacillation. And Bodhidharma talks about this, about what we observe in Zazen, or the breath coming and going, the physical sensation, sometimes hot, sometimes cold, the mental sensations, sometimes confused, sometimes stark clarity, etc. Emotional mood swings, sometimes elated, sometimes depressed, and so forth. And I think his main point was, as we see that these are all like the breath, constantly coming and going, they're impermanent. We begin to, as Shinjin was saying, we begin to internalize or assimilate the idea of impermanence, that all these things we associate with ourself are impermanent. Therefore, the self must also be impermanent, or the observer must be impermanent. But I think it's important for us to carry that a step further and understand that while we may have a preference for being very calm and clear and so forth, when we're not, when we're agitated and when we're confused and so forth, that's also Buddha mind. We're just on the other end of the pendulum swing, and the pendulum will swing back again. Of course, you know, we can argue that the pendulum can break in cases of mental disorders, neurosis, and so forth. But having a preference in Buddhism, the great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences, I think, is not, you know, between chocolate and vanilla ice cream. It's more like, do I have a preference for a given state of awareness? Do I have a preference in that sense, in a more immediate and continuing sense? So that as we go through the vacillation, if we accept and understand that the vacillation itself is the Buddha mind functioning, its nature is to vacillate between citta, analysis, bodhi, intuition, compassion, wisdom, you know, all the various polar binaries you could think of, like cold and warm. They're all temporary, as Bodhidharma points out. But the other point is that while we're in them, they don't seem temporary. It seems like, you know, this is wrong, I'm not doing this right, I'm failing, you know, and we discourage ourselves. But if we can keep in mind that this is just the natural functioning of your mind. It wavers over to this extreme, then it goes back to the other extreme, it'll come back again. And in a way, we hit those aren't the same places. As time moves on, we're hitting those on deeper and deeper levels. So we have to have some faith in mind, or trust in mind, like the old Chinese poem title, that this is all natural. And if we don't give up, we'll come to a point where, you know, as Shinjin is saying, manifestation will occur. You know, we can't make it happen. We can get clear, and we can practice, you know, actualizing our practice through non-thinking and so forth. But we have to have faith, some kind of faith. It's not a blind faith. It's based on the history of our ancestors. That a breakthrough can occur if we set the platform. As Buddha was saying, if it's based on the Four Noble Truths, if it's based on the Eightfold Path, then you really can't go far wrong. But then in the Lotus Sutra, he says actually no path. The Lotus Sutra is attributed his last teaching, and so he says things that seem to contradict the early teaching. And he also says we don't need no stinking teachers, which is one of the points Shinjin is making. So that was the three-part Lotus Sutra has a kind of bookended by a short teaching on the front and a short teaching at the back, in which he makes these new teachings that did not exist in any of his prior teachings. And so these were part of the last message to his followers, that you don't need a teacher actually. Doesn't hurt if they're a true teacher, it doesn't hurt.
And I have a question offline from Facebook. David E. Doss. He says, no question exactly, just a comment that I would like to greatly enjoy more history and how the various teachers applied the Dharma down through the centuries. I much appreciate this topic, Gasho.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much what we're going to do the third week of every month. There'll be the talk on the third weekend is going to really focus on the patriarchs and the history and the lineage, and you know how the Dharma changed and was perceived different times. So that's what we'll be doing on the third. And you know it's a lot of fun for me to research all this stuff. So I have a blast looking it up. But the vacillation that Hojo was just talking about, that was, as I went through this, that's kind of how I was seeing Mahakassapa and Ananda kind of embodying the two sides of these two opposites in the teaching, vacillating between the two of them, you know, what they embodied themselves. And, you know, I don't think the original writers were thinking in those kinds of terms, so we don't have that level of detail assumption. That was what I started to pull out of it was, you know, you had these two opposing views of how to do this. And without both views, the movement itself wouldn't have survived. Because Ananda became the second big one. Even though the sources say they both died around the same time, Ananda eventually became the second.
So David, thank you for your comments there, Gasho. It'll continue on every third Sunday with Shinjin Sensei and ancestor teaching.
Okay, anybody have anything else? All right, well, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for your teaching, Shinjin.
Thank you.
And again, folks, as always, we thank you so much for your support and for your continued showing up and your continued consistency to practice. Those who are not members, we would invite you to become a member. And those who are continued members, we appreciate your support. And because this is what it takes for us to continue to offer the space and to offer these teachings. Just a short update. Again, Hojo Sensei is going to be on next week talking about his new release. I'm hoping we get some nuggets of his newly released book at that time next week in our Contemporary Zen Talk. We also have a Zaza Zenkai coming up with Falmouth Sit, 6:30 a.m. to noon next Sunday. And then we have first Sunday guest speaker, Kanzan John Flattery, coming up. So we have some really great opportunities for practice, continued practice within our community every single day. So please check out our website, ASZC.org and STO.org. And we'll mention we do have a spring retreat coming up in May. And of course, Hojo Sensei will allow you some time to speak. But again, everybody, thank you for your continued support. And I'll hand the virtual ball over to Hojo Sensei.
No, I just wanted to remind everybody of on the 14th of March, I am a guest speaker for San Shinji, Hoko Carnegus, who spoke with us the first Sunday of this month. So we'll flip it that way, and I think we'll all join. I don't know exactly what your plans are, Fusats, for that, but I thought we would just do a combined Sangha on the 14th of March.
That's right. And that's our sister Sangha and Okamura Roshi Sangha, and also our lineage, second lineage to that. So we're actually having some creative partnerships there. So we're hoping that that continues as we continue to see them seating us and us seating them, and we can create some really great practice opportunities between our Sanghas. So that's coming up, and we will start marketing that as well. So anything else from anyone else? I think we're good. If not, we'll go ahead and do our closing verses. Again, everyone, thank you so much. Continue to be safe throughout this time. And again, as always, we appreciate the Sangha, the third jewel. Gasho. Yeah.
Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to enter them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to enter them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it.
Have a great week. Again, John, I want some new baby pictures. Gotcha.
I'll send them along, don't worry.
Thank you.